Hello everyone. In this video, I want to introduce you to the Jupyter Notebook and explain why Jupyter Notebooks are so popular in the data science community. So first off, a Jupyter Notebook is a tool that's used to not only execute code, but also document and explain the code and its results. So what's nice about Jupyter Notebooks is they provide context for the data and for the algorithms operating on the data. I have a quote here from Vic Parchuri from Building a Data Science Portfolio, Storytelling with Data that I want to read to you because I think it's so important for motivating Jupyter Notebooks and more generally data storytelling. So let's read it. Data science is fundamentally about communication. You'll discover some insight in the data, then figure out an effective way to communicate that insight to others. Then sell them on the course of action you propose. One of the most critical skills in data science is being able to tell an effective story using data. An effective story can make your insights much more compelling and help others understand your ideas. A story in the data science context is a narrative around what you found, how you found it, and what it means. An example might be the discovery that your company's revenue has dropped 20% in the last year. It's not enough to just state that fact. You'll have to communicate why revenue dropped and how to potentially fix it. I'd like to add to this quote that data storytelling is also about providing details about your experimental design and your results so that your experiment and your results are reproducible. Very important. All right, so now you have a little bit of an insight about why Jupyter Notebooks are so popular in the data science community. They're used to tell stories about data. Now let's see a Jupyter Notebook in action. Well, in fact, I'm in a Jupyter Notebook right now. Let me scroll up. So I'm on GitHub and I'm in cjupyternotebook.ipynb. So the .ipynb extension stands for IPython Notebook. So ipynb is a Jupyter Notebook. And you can see I've got some documentation here describing the class, what lesson it is. I've got a bulleted list with some of the learning objectives. I've got links to other sites. I've got indented block quotes here, more lists. Okay, I've got a lot of documentation in this Jupyter Notebook, right? Let me show you an example of running code inside of a Jupyter Notebook to see the results visualized with Matplotlib. So here I've got a header, plot examples, subheader, line plots, and I describe what is a line plot, and then I show an example in Python of how to use a line plot. And what's really cool about Jupyter Notebooks with some of the plotting libraries like Matplotlib is you can show the plot inline your Jupyter Notebook. So here's an example of code to produce a line plot, and then bam, right here. Here is the line plot right below the code. Very cool. Also, something that's neat about Jupyter Notebooks is in addition to supporting what's called Markdown for creating the documentation for your code, it also supports LaTeX or LaTeX. Let me show you an example of LaTeX. So LaTeX is commonly used by the mathematics and scientific computing community in order to typeset mathematical formulas and notation. So here I've got some Markdown that I wrote a few years ago with some inline LaTeX. And you can see the LaTeX because it's kind of scripty and kind of italicized looking, like D sub I and D sub J, F sub I, F sub J. And then I've also used LaTeX here, not in line, but as a block in order to highlight an important equation here. So this is an example of LaTeX used with Markdown in order to document a mathematical formula and an algorithmic approach. All right, so there's some insight into what Jupyter Notebooks look like. These ones are hosted on GitHub, so they're not editable. Okay, I can't run the code like this code here. I'm just seeing the output. Let me show you how you can create a Jupyter Notebook and edit the Markdown and also run the Python code you type in what's called code cells. All right, there are a lot of different ways that you can launch and edit a Jupyter Notebook. So I want to show you a few. First off, if you install the Anaconda Python distribution, then you should be able to launch a program on your machine called Anaconda Navigator. Anaconda Navigator is kind of a dashboard for a lot of the programs and tools that come with the Anaconda Python distribution. So for example, my Anaconda Navigator is showing Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebook. Both Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebook can be used in order to create and edit Jupyter Notebooks. So that's really cool. We have two ways to do this right out of the box here with Anaconda Python distribution. I'll scroll down just so you can see some other tools that come with Anaconda Navigator. All right, so let's start with Jupyter Notebook. Jupyter Notebook is the original way to create and edit Jupyter Notebooks. Jupyter Lab is like the newer way that is superseding Jupyter Notebook, and eventually, but probably quite soon, we'll see Jupyter Notebook being phased out and deprecated. But let's take a look at Jupyter Notebook. I'm going to click Launch. And what we're going to see is Jupyter Notebook running in Google Chrome or whichever web browser is your default web browser. So if you look at the top here, the URL is localhost 8889/tree. Okay, localhost 8889/tree. Okay, so what this means in a nutshell is that even though we're open in Chrome, we are not connected to a server on the internet. We're instead just running this Jupyter Notebook like a website running on our local computer as a server. Okay, so if you see localhost, just think running on this computer. Okay, it's not actually running on the web. Google Chrome is just being used to open HTML that's running locally on your machine. All right, so by default, this is going to open to your root directory or your home directory. And then on Windows, it usually opens to the same thing like your C drive or your home directory, like your C users and then your username directory. All right, so this is showing me essentially a file listing, right? Just like I might see in Finder or in File Explorer. And so I can click through these folders, like I'm gonna go to Desktop. I'm gonna go to CPC 222, and I'm gonna click on Temp. This is a little folder that I made for this demo here. And there's nothing in Temp. It says the notebook list is empty, but I can make a new Jupyter Notebook. And I'm gonna choose Python 3 as the kernel for my notebook, meaning this is going to be the programming language used to execute my code cells. All right, so now we have our first Jupyter Notebook created. So at the top, we can put a name for it. So I'll say Jupyter Notebook Hello World. Okay, so this is called Jupyter Notebook Hello World.ipynb. Okay, if I go back to my file listing, which is the other tab, I'll see that I now have a file, Jupyter Notebook Hello World.ipynb. It says it is running. Awesome. All right, so here's the tab where it's running. And just really briefly, let me show you how you can get some code up and running in Jupyter Notebook. All right, let's write our first bit of Python code in a Jupyter Notebook. So by default, we have one code cell here. I know it's a code cell because it says in hard bracket, colon, and then I've got a line number for like lines of code in an editor. So let's print out hello world. And I can press this run button to run my code. It's going to run my code and then advance to the next code cell. If there isn't another code cell, it's going to create one. And I can see up here in my hard bracket, there's a number, which is the number of times we've executed Python code. So I could do this again, and you can see that the number keeps going up. Now, the code cells can be ran independently, though all of the identifiers, for example, variables and functions you define in a code cell, are accessible globally after you've ran that code cell. Okay, so let's say, for example, I do x is assigned 5. I'll press run. Okay, now in this different code cell, I can print out x. Even though they're different code cells, okay, they have access to each other's namespaces, right? For example, using an identifier like a variable. As long as that code cell has been ran previously, then I can access that variable x. All right. Clicking run is kind of inefficient, right? It's always nice to learn the keyboard shortcuts. So the equivalent of run is shift enter. So let's do another example. Let's do hello again. If I do shift enter, this is going to run my code and advance to the next cell. If I do control enter, it's going to run this code cell, but not advance to the next cell. So if I just do control enter over and over again, then you can see that I'm not advancing to the next cell, but my number in my hard brackets here for the number of times we've executed Python code goes up. All right. One more thing I want to show you in this really brief overview of Jupyter Notebooks is how you can make a markdown cell. Okay, so remember we were talking about how you can have markdown cells where you document your code, and then you can have code cells where you have your code and you run it. And in this particular example, we were producing a matplotlib plot, and the output for the plot showed up right below, just like the output for our print statements are showing up right below. All right, so you can come up to the top and you can say insert cell below, okay? And then you can change this cell from a code cell to a markdown cell. You can see there are two other types of code cells, two other types of notebook cells, raw and heading. You typically don't use raw too much, and then heading is just like a markdown cell, except for it's just used to show a heading or a header. So typically the two you use all the time are code and markdown cells. So let's convert this cell to be a markdown cell. Okay, note that it doesn't have the in hard bracket colon here, but we still do have the line numbers for keeping track of our lines of markdown. So I'm not going to introduce markdown in this video, but let's just write a little bit of code to see what a markdown cell looks like. So right now we're in edit mode, just like when we edit our code, right? We type and then we run it. So let's type. Let's do something like, this is a level 1 heading. Okay, same thing. I can do shift enter to run this markdown cell, which is going to render it. Or I can use control enter, right? That will not advance to the next cell. I'll do shift enter. And there we see that our level 1 heading is rendered as a HTML level 1 heading. I can double click to get back into edit mode. I'll just say, this is some paragraph text that describes the code below. Okay, shift enter, and then here I might have, this is the code that was described above. All right, so this is just a brief overview of Jupyter Notebooks. You've got your code cells and you've got your markdown cells. So shift enter and control enter to run your code cells and render your markdown cells. And there are other really great keyboard shortcuts, but I'm not going to introduce them right now. All right, so let's save our Jupyter Notebook hello world.ipynb file. Okay, so little save button or Command S, Control S. Okay, when we're done with our Jupyter Notebook, we'll go File, Close, and Halt. Okay, this is key here, the halt part, because it's going to shut down your kernel, which is essentially your Python interpreter that's running so that we can execute our code cells. So close and halt, and it goes away. We can come back to our kind of file listing and see that it no longer says running next to Jupyter Notebook Hello World. All right, I'm going to quit. I'm done with the little Jupyter Notebook demo. Okay, server stopped. You have shut down Jupyter. You can now close this tab. Perfect. Okay, so now let's take a look at Jupyter Lab. Jupyter Lab is based on Jupyter Notebook, but one of the key differences, among many, but one of the key differences, every time you launch a Jupyter Notebook in Jupyter Lab, it doesn't launch in a new Google Chrome or web browser tab. It's launched in a new tab inside of this Jupyter Lab tab, which I really like because I usually have like at least 5 to 10 Jupyter Notebooks open, and I don't want to have 5 to 10 Google Chrome tabs, one for each one of my Jupyter Notebooks. Instead, I'll just have them all inside of this one Jupyter Lab Google Chrome tab. All right, so same thing. I've got over here our file listing. right? So I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to go to CPSC 222. I'm going to go to temp. There's my Jupyter Notebook hello world.ipynb file that we were just editing in Jupyter Notebook. Okay, and if I want, I can double click it to open it in Jupyter Lab. You can see I also have this launcher tab inside of Jupyter Lab where I can create a new Python 3 notebook just by clicking on this button. So let's do this. Create a new Jupyter Notebook, okay? And I'll also double click on Jupyter Notebook hello world.ipynb so I can open this one as well. And note that I have a green circle showing that untitled.ipynb is running. I don't have a green circle on Jupyter Notebook hello world.ipynb because it's not running. But if I double click it, it's now running. And here it is. Okay, fantastic. So what I want to do is I want to rename this untitled.ipynb. Let's call it Jupyter Lab hello world. Okay, and same thing, same command. So perhaps I want to do hello world. I can do shift enter or control enter, or I can press play right here. Okay, if I want to make this into a markdown cell, I can go up here and change it to markdown. Maybe I'll do this is a level 2 heading. Hello. Shift enter, control enter, either one. Okay, and it's going to render it. Okay, so Jupyter Lab, to recap, is a newer way to work with Jupyter Notebooks than the original Jupyter Notebook we were just working with. I like it because the file listing is not on its own tab. It's just a sidebar on the left over here. I like it because every time you open a Jupyter Notebook, it opens a new tab inside of Jupyter Lab, not a new tab inside of Google Chrome. All right, so let's say I'm done with Jupyter Lab Hello World and Jupyter Notebook Hello World. Okay, I'll save, hit this button right here, or Command S, Control S. Okay, and then we can go to kernel, shut down kernel. Okay, that's going to shut down the Python interpreter running for the currently selected IPYNB file. Okay, note that the green dot is gone. So now I can close this. Same thing over here. Kernel, shut down kernel, and now I can close this. If I don't have any Jupyter Notebook open, we'll just see this default launcher tab, which is where we can just click right here to create a new Jupyter Notebook. All right, so we're done with Jupyter Lab. So I'm gonna go File, Shut Down, and I will shut down Jupyter Lab. We see something very similar, server stop. You have shut down the Jupyter Notebook server. You can now close this tab, and I'll close it. All right, so that's all I wanted to show within Anaconda Navigator. Now I want to show you how you can launch Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Notebook from command line. So when you launch it from Anaconda Navigator, Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Notebook, like I said, it's going to bring you to some default current working directory like your root folder or your home folder or your users folder, something like this. But if you want to launch Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Notebook inside of a very specific current working directory, like for example, over here in my terminal, my present working directory or my current working directory is root users, gsprint, desktop, CPC 222 temp. If I wanted to launch, say, Jupyter Lab with this as its current working directory, I could type Jupyter space lab here, and it's going to launch Jupyter Lab where the current working directory is that temp directory. So you can see over here on the left side that my relative root path is the temp directory, and that's all I can access is the temp directory and its files and subfolders. Okay, if I want to launch, say, Jupyter Notebook, just type Jupyter Notebook. And we can see once again that the current working directory of Jupyter Notebook is the temp folder. All right, next, let me show you that VS Code actually supports editing of Jupyter Notebooks. So instead of using Jupyter Notebook or Jupyter Lab, you could use VS Code. So let me go ahead and show you that I've got VS Code open to our temp folder. Okay, here are those two Jupyter Notebooks that we were editing in our browser. All right, so let's say we want to open Jupyter Notebook hello world.ipynb. We can launch it in VS Code. It's going to look a little bit different, but the basic functionality is still there. So here are all of our code cells, and each one has its own little green play or run button. So I can click on each one to run them. And here is our Markdown cell. Okay, it's depicted with these kind of curly brackets here. I can double click on it to enter edit mode. And same thing, Control Enter or Shift Enter to render a Markdown cell or to run a code cell. All right, up at the top, we can stop our IPython kernel or kill it, so to speak, like we were doing in the browser. So I'll save, I'll kill it, and then I'll shut it down. All right, so that's a brief overview of how you can work with Jupyter Notebooks inside of VS Code. It's not as featureful, so I find myself using Jupyter Lab more so than VS Code for editing my notebooks, but it's good to know that if you have, say, like IPynb files mixed in with some Python files and you're running those Python files in VS Code, you can just take a look at those IPynb files and run them in VS Code as well. All right, the last thing I want to show you related to editing and running Jupyter Notebooks is Google Colab. So all three of these examples, Jupyter Notebook, Jupyter Lab, and VS Code, have been running Jupyter Notebooks locally, but you can also run them in your browser. So if you go to colab.research.google.com, you're going to see something like Jupyter Lab, but running on the Google infrastructure, the Google servers, instead of running as a local server on your own machine. All right, so here's going to be kind of your splash page here. Examples, recent Jupyter Notebooks you've been working with, Google Drive, GitHub, and Upload. So these are some really cool features that Google Colab has. For example, cloning GitHub repositories and then working on the Jupyter Notebooks from those GitHub repositories right in Colab. Let's just come down to the bottom and click New Jupyter Notebook. And here we've got untitled0.ipynb. I can click on this to change this. I'll say Google Colab hello world. Okay, I can click on our first cell. You can see the little play button next to it. It is a code cell. Let's do print hello world. I can click play to run it. You can see over here it said initializing, connecting, and now it's running our Python code. So it'll be a little faster. Let's do print again. And there we go. If I want to add a Markdown cell, then I can simply click plus text to add a new Markdown cell below. Or if I kind of hover towards the top of the cell, I can do plus text to add a Markdown cell above. So let's add a Markdown cell below. Let's do a level 3 header this time. Okay, so here we see a preview of the rendering of this Markdown on the right. But if I shift enter to run it, it's going to be rendered. But if I double click to go into editing mode, it's really neat that on the left side I see my Markdown source code, and on the right side I see it rendered in HTML. All right, so Google Colab is another way to work with Jupyter Notebooks. Okay, this one is running on the Google infrastructure. Okay, so this Google Colab hello world.ipynb, this is saved to my Google Drive. Okay, so it's up in the cloud. This is really great if you're on a machine that doesn't have, say, the Anaconda Python distribution or Python installed, and you want to be able to work on your code from any machine, regardless of what's installed on it locally. All right, so just to recap, Jupyter Notebooks are a list of cells where the cells are typically either code cells like we have here where we can run Python code, Or they're Markdown cells like we have here, where we can write Markdown and then have that Markdown be rendered in this nice typeset font. Markdown's pretty powerful. We can do more than just text. We can do lists and tables and images and links and all sorts of fun things. All right, I'm almost done with the video. I've showed you how to launch and create Jupyter Notebooks, how to briefly edit them. There's so much more. This was just a high-level overview. The last thing I want to show you is how can you kind of export them, right? So typically if you're editing a Word document, maybe like your resume, and you're done editing, you'll go up to like File, Save As, or File Export, and you'll export your Word document as a PDF. And then the PDF isn't as editable, right? Depends on what program you open it with. But your PDF is like an uneditable version of your Word document or your resume, right? And then that PDF is what you share with the world, like potential employers, right? If you're applying for a job at their company. So to export a Jupyter Notebook, there are a few things you can do. So one, you can go up to File, okay? And you can download .ipynb, download.py. You can also, if you're working with Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Notebook, here, I'll just launch Jupyter Notebook. You can go up to the top, you can do File, Download As, and look at all these different file types you can download it as. In fact, you can download your Jupyter Notebook as a PDF if you wanted to export it as a PDF. Okay, and then lastly, if you were to put a folder under version control using Git, and it has a Jupyter Notebook, and then push that Jupyter Notebook to GitHub, GitHub will render your Jupyter Notebooks. So here I am on GitHub. Okay, I've got a data visualization.ipynb, and GitHub will render your Jupyter Notebook. So that's really neat. There's also this other tool for viewing Jupyter Notebooks called nbviewer or Notebook Viewer. So here I have this same Jupyter Notebook open in Jupyter nbviewer or Notebook Viewer, where essentially you go to nbviewer.jupyter.org and then you put a path to some Jupyter Notebook on the web. So for example, I did /GitHub and then I pasted the path to that data visualization.ipynb file on GitHub. Okay, so I just took this, I copied it, and I pasted it here. And then Notebook Viewer will go to GitHub, grab that Jupyter Notebook, and render it in this nice kind of website style or PDF style viewing. Okay, you can't run the code. Okay, it's just a viewer. But it's a really nice way to share your Jupyter Notebooks with the rest of the world on the web. All right, that wraps up our Jupyter Notebook introduction. I showed you 4 different ways to launch and edit Jupyter Notebooks, and then I showed you 3 different ways for exporting your Jupyter Notebooks, right? So depending on what tool you're using, like Colab or Jupyter Notebook or Jupyter Lab, you can export them in many different file types. Right here, and you can also put them on GitHub, view them straight on GitHub in non-editing view only mode, or you can use Notebook Viewer, Jupyter nbviewer. All right, thanks for watching.